The dust had barely settled on Prudence Barlow's third husband's grave when the women of Park City, Utah started crossing to the other side of Main Street whenever she approached, and that was when the cowboy rode into town with his hat pulled low and his future written in her eyes. It was late summer in 1876, and the heat shimmered off the wooden planks of the boardwalk as Prudence walked from the general store to her small house at the edge of town. She carried a single bag of flour, because that was all she could afford on the small inheritance her late husband Thomas had left her. The storekeeper had practically thrown the bag at her, refusing to touch her hand when she'd offered payment. 3 dead husbands in 5 years would do that to a woman's reputation. The first had been Samuel Wright, a banker's son she'd married when she was 18. He'd seemed healthy as a horse until he'd collapsed at his desk 6 months after their wedding, his heart simply stopping according to Doc Morrison. The second, Robert Finch, had been a cattleman who'd courted her desperately despite the whispers. He'd lasted 8 months before a rattlesnake found him checking fence lines. The third, Thomas Barlow, had been a widower with kind eyes who'd told her he didn't believe in curses. Pneumonia had taken him after just 4 months of marriage. Now at 23, Prudence had resigned herself to a life alone. She'd learned to ignore the pointed fingers, the whispered prayers, the mothers who pulled their children close when she passed. She'd learned to hold her head high, even when the Methodist preacher suggested from his pulpit that some women carried darkness with them whether they meant to or not. She was unpacking the flour in her kitchen when she heard the horse outside. Through the window, she saw him for the first time, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He was leading his paint horse toward the livery stable, moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it. He couldn't have been much older than 30, and there was something about the set of his shoulders that made her heart do an unexpected flutter before she forced herself to look away. A widow 3 times over had no business noticing handsome cowboys. The next morning, she encountered him at the post office. She was checking for a letter from her sister in Denver when he walked in, his spurs chiming softly against the wooden floor. He tipped his hat to her, his gray eyes meeting hers directly without the usual fear or disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "Morning, madam," he said, his voice warm and rough like sun-heated stone. "Good morning," she managed, startled enough by his courtesy that she nearly dropped the letter the postmaster had finally, reluctantly handed her. "Name's Jackson Abbott," he continued, extending his hand. "Just arrived yesterday, looking for ranch work in the area." She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Behind the counter, the postmaster made a small sound of warning. But Jackson Abbott didn't lower his hand, didn't look away, didn't seem to notice or care about the sudden tension in the room. Slowly, Prudence placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip gentle but firm. "Prudence Barlow," she said quietly. She waited for the recognition, the quick withdrawal, the muttered excuse. Instead, he smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made small creases appear at their corners. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Barlow." "It's just Prudence," she said, then immediately regretted it. That sounded too familiar, too forward. But he only nodded, released her hand with what seemed like reluctance, and turned to conduct his business with the postmaster. Prudence fled, her heart pounding in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Over the next week, she kept seeing him around town. He'd found work at the Richardson Ranch just outside Park City, and he came into town every few days for supplies or to have his horse shod. Each time he saw her, he tipped his hat and greeted her by name, treating her with the same easy courtesy he showed everyone else. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. "Someone ought to warn that poor cowboy," Prudence heard Mrs. Henderson say to Mrs. Cooper outside the mercantile, "before he ends up like the others." "Maybe he already knows," Mrs. Cooper replied darkly. "Maybe he's got a death wish." Prudence had learned to pretend she didn't hear such things, but they still cut deep. She hurried past with her head down, only to nearly collide with Jackson as he came around the corner. His hands caught her shoulders, steadying her. "Whoa there," he said gently. "You all right?" She looked up at him, and something in her face must have given away her distress because his expression softened. His hands were still on her shoulders, warm through the fabric of her dress. "I'm fine," she said, stepping back. His hands fell away. "I should go." "Prudence, wait." Something in his tone made her pause. "I was wondering if you might do me a favor." She turned back, wary. In her experience, when men asked favors of women, it rarely ended well for the women. "I'm new to town," he continued, "and I don't know a soul except the Richardson family and the ranch hands. I was hoping you might be willing to show me around sometime. Help me get my bearings." She stared at him. "You want me to show you around, if you're willing. I'd appreciate the company." "Mr. Abbott," she said carefully, "I don't think you understand. People in this town believe I'm cursed. They think I killed my 3 husbands or brought bad luck upon them, or that the devil himself follows in my shadow. If you're seen spending time with me, they'll think you're marked for death too." He considered this for a moment, his gray eyes never leaving her face. Then he said, "I don't put much stock in curses or gossip. I put stock in what I can see with my own eyes. And what I see is a kind woman who deserves better than being treated like a leper." "You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "but I'd like to, if you'll let me." Every sensible part of her screamed that she should refuse, should protect this man from whatever darkness seemed to follow her. But she was so desperately lonely, so tired of being alone, and his eyes were so warm and sincere. "All right," she heard herself say. "Tomorrow afternoon, I could show you some of the trails in the hills if you'd like." His smile was like sunrise. "I'd like that very much." She barely slept that night, alternating between anticipation and dread. What was she thinking, agreeing to spend time with him? What if something happened to him? What if the curse, if there even was such a thing, struck him down too? But when he arrived at her door the next afternoon, leading 2 horses and wearing that warm smile, her worries faded into the background. They rode out into the hills east of town, following trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The late summer air was clear and sweet, and for the first time in months, Prudence felt something close to peace. Jackson was easy to talk to. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, about losing his parents to fever when he was 17, about the years he'd spent drifting from job to job, looking for a place that felt like home. She found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, about her childhood in a strict household, about her dreams of seeing the ocean someday, about the garden she kept behind her house where she grew vegetables and flowers and felt closest to something like contentment. They didn't talk about her dead husbands, and she was grateful for that. When they returned to town as the sun was setting, she felt lighter than she had in years. Jackson helped her dismount, his hands steady at her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could smell the clean scent of him, leather and sage and something uniquely his own. "Thank you for today," he said softly. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much." "Neither can I," she admitted. "Can we do this again?" She knew she should say no. She should protect him, push him away, keep him safe from whatever fate seemed to befall men who got close to her. But looking into his eyes, she found she couldn't quite form the word. "Yes," she whispered instead. Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Jackson would finish his work at the Richardson Ranch and ride into town, and they would walk together or ride out into the countryside. They talked about everything and nothing. Books they'd read, places they'd been, dreams they harbored. He told her about his hope to save enough money to buy his own small ranch someday. She confessed that she'd always wanted to learn to paint, but had never had the courage to try. The next time he came to town, he brought her a set of watercolors and paper he'd ordered from Salt Lake City. "For you," he said simply, pressing the package into her hands. "Everyone should get to chase at least one dream." She stared at the gift, her eyes stinging with unexpected tears. "Jackson, I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not nearly enough," he said quietly. "Please, I want you to have it." That night, she sat at her kitchen table and tried to paint the view from her window. The mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in late summer. The painting was clumsy and amateurish, but she'd never felt such joy in creating something. The town's whispers grew louder and darker. Prudence heard the speculation everywhere she went. How long would this one last? Would it be his heart like the first? An accident like the second? Disease like the third? Some suggested Jackson was a fool. Others said he must be after her money, though anyone who knew her circumstances understood there was precious little of that. A few whispered that perhaps he was in league with the devil himself, immune to the curse that protected its own. Jackson heard the whispers too, Prudence knew, but he never mentioned them. He simply kept showing up, kept treating her with respect and warmth, kept looking at her like she was something precious rather than something to be feared. One evening in late September, they were sitting by the stream that ran through the hills above town, watching the water catch the last rays of sunlight. The aspen leaves were turning gold, and there was a crispness in the air that spoke of approaching autumn. "Prudence," Jackson said, his voice unusually hesitant, "can I ask you something, of course? Your husbands, the three who died, did you love them?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "I cared for them," she said finally. "Samuel was kind to me in his way. Robert made me laugh. Thomas felt like safety after so much loss. But did I love them the way the poets write about? The way that makes your heart feel too big for your chest and makes the whole world seem brighter?" She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "No. I don't think I did. And now," his voice was soft, careful, "do you think you could love someone that way?" She turned to look at him then, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was a man standing on the edge of something, waiting to see if she would catch him or let him fall. "I think," she said slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it, "that I already do." The words hung in the air between them for a heartbeat, 2, 3. Then Jackson was reaching for her, his hand cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness, and she was leaning into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "I've been in love with you since the first time you smiled at me," he said, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I know the town thinks I'm crazy. I know you're worried about this curse. But Prudence, I don't care. I would rather have one day of loving you than 100 years of safety without you. Jackson, you don't understand. 3 men have died. 3 good men who made the mistake of marrying me. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. Nothing is going to happen to me. You can't know that. You're right, I can't. None of us knows how long we have. But I know that I want to spend whatever time I've got with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to help you tend your garden and watch you paint and hear about your day. I want to give you the life you deserve, full of love and laughter instead of fear and loneliness. The whole town thinks I'm cursed. Then let them think it. Prudence, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "I don't believe in curses. I believe in bad luck and worse timing. I believe that you've suffered more loss than anyone should have to bear. But I don't believe for 1 second that you caused any of it, and I'm not going to let fear of what might happen keep me from the best thing that's ever walked into my life." A tear slipped down her cheek and he caught it with his thumb. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know, but I'm not." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Marry me, Prudence. Be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my life proving to you and everyone else in this narrow-minded town that the only thing you're cursed with is bad luck, and that our love is strong enough to break any curse that ever existed. Jackson, I'll be your fourth husband," he said firmly. "And I'll be your last, because I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to grow old with you, Prudence Barlow. I'm going to be the one who finally gets it right." She was crying in earnest now, tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in so long they were tears of hope rather than grief. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Prudence felt something inside her chest crack open and bloom like her garden after a long winter. This was what love was supposed to feel like. This overwhelming, terrifying, wonderful feeling that made everything else fade into insignificance. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers again. "We'll do it right," he said. "A proper courtship, a proper wedding. I want everyone to see that I'm choosing this, choosing you with my eyes wide open and my heart full. They'll try to talk you out of it. Let them try." They rode back to town in the gathering darkness, and Jackson walked her to her door like a proper gentleman. Before he left, he kissed her once more, gentle and reverent, and Prudence went to bed that night feeling like she was floating. The next morning, Jackson went to speak with Reverend Peterson about posting the banns. The Reverend, a severe man with iron gray hair and harder eyes, tried everything in his power to dissuade him. "Son, I appreciate that you're new to town and might not understand the situation fully," Reverend Peterson said, his hands folded on his desk in a gesture that might have looked peaceful if not for the white of his knuckles. "But that woman has buried 3 husbands. 3 good Christian men who all met untimely ends after marrying her." "I'm aware of her history," Jackson said calmly. "Then surely you must see that the Lord is sending a message. Some women are not meant for marriage. Some carry with them a darkness that, with all due respect, Reverend, the only darkness I see is in the hearts of people who would blame a grieving widow for tragedies beyond her control." Jackson's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "Samuel Wright died of heart failure. The doctor confirmed it. Robert Finch was bitten by a rattlesnake, a common enough danger in these parts. Thomas Barlow contracted pneumonia during one of the wettest winters on record. These were not supernatural occurrences. They were terrible luck, nothing more. The pattern is that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and it's easier to blame a woman than to accept that we don't control everything in this world." Jackson stood. "Now, are you going to post the banns, or do I need to ride to Salt Lake City and find a minister who practices actual Christian charity?" The Reverend's face flushed red, but he nodded stiffly. "I'll post them, but don't say I didn't warn you when you're lying in your grave before Christmas." "Duly noted," Jackson said and walked out. News spread through Park City like wildfire. The crazy cowboy was actually going to marry the widow. Bets were placed on how long he'd last. Some gave him 6 months. Others, more pessimistic, said he'd be dead before the wedding even took place. Prudence heard it all. She tried to maintain her composure, but the constant speculation wore on her. What if they were right? What if something did happen to Jackson? She would never forgive herself. She was in her garden, viciously attacking the weeds as an outlet for her anxiety, when Jackson found her 3 days after his confrontation with the Reverend. "You're murdering those dandelions," he observed, settling onto the ground beside her despite his clean clothes. "They're persistent," she muttered. "So am I." He caught her hand, stilling her frantic movement. "Talk to me. What's wrong? What's wrong?" "Jackson, the whole town is laying odds on when you'll die. Mrs. Henderson told me to my face yesterday that I should have the decency to leave town before I add another body to the graveyard. Mr. Cooper at the Mercantile suggested I might be a witch and perhaps burning would be the appropriate remedy." Jackson's expression darkened. "He said that to you?" "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." He stood, pulling her up with him. "Come with me." "Where? You'll see." He led her to the center of town, right to Main Street where the most people would be gathered for the Saturday market. Prudence tried to pull back, humiliation burning in her chest, but Jackson held her hand firmly. Then, in the middle of the street, in front of God and everyone, he pulled her close and kissed her. Not a chaste peck, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and unmistakable in its meaning. When he finally released her, leaving her breathless and flushed, he turned to address the gathered crowd. "I know you all have opinions about my engagement to Prudence," he called out, his voice carrying clear and strong. "I know you think I'm foolish or suicidal or under some kind of spell. So let me make this crystal clear. I love this woman. I choose this woman. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly instead of whispering behind her back like cowards." The silence was deafening. Prudence wanted to sink into the ground, but Jackson's arm around her waist kept her upright. "Furthermore," he continued, "if I hear that anyone has threatened her, insulted her, or suggested burning her at the stake," his eyes found Mr. Cooper, who had the grace to look ashamed, "they'll answer to me. She's done nothing wrong. She's lost 3 husbands, which makes her the victim of tragedy, not the cause of it. And it's past time this town started acting like Christians instead of like a medieval mob." He waited, as if daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Finally, he nodded once and led Prudence away, his head high. She didn't speak until they were back at her house. Then she turned to him, torn between exasperation and wonder. "You can't go around kissing me in the street and challenging the entire town." "I can and I will," he said firmly. "Prudence, I meant what I said. I'm not going to let them treat you this way. I'm not going to hide my feelings or pretend to be ashamed of loving you. The more we act like there's something wrong with our relationship, the more they'll believe it. You're impossible. I'm in love." He cupped her face in his hands. "And I'm going to marry you in 6 weeks, and we're going to be so happy it'll make everyone's teeth ache." Despite everything, she laughed. 6 weeks. That's how long the banns have to be posted. Then you're mine, Prudence Barlow, or rather, Prudence Abbott. He tried out the name, smiling. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," she admitted softly. The weeks leading up to the wedding were both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because Jackson courted her properly, bringing her flowers and taking her on picnics, and treating her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Terrible because the town's hostility, while somewhat muted after Jackson's public declaration, hadn't disappeared. Most of the townswomen refused to help Prudence prepare for the wedding. She had no bridesmaids, no one to help her sew her dress or plan the reception. She tried not to let it hurt, but Jackson noticed anyway. "I'm sorry," she said one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset. "I'm sorry your wedding won't be what it should be. No friends, no celebration, just a widow and a stubborn cowboy and a town full of people waiting for you to die." "Hey." He turned her face toward him. "This wedding will be exactly what it should be because I'll be marrying you. That's all that matters. You deserve better than this. I deserve you. and that's more than I ever dared to hope for. 2 weeks before the wedding, Jackson's luck seemed to run out. He was working at the Richardson Ranch when a half-broken horse threw him, and he landed hard enough to knock himself unconscious. Prudence didn't hear about it until hours later, when one of the ranch hands came to fetch her. She rode out to the ranch in a blind panic, her mind filled with visions of Jackson dead or dying, the curse claiming another victim. When she burst into the bunkhouse where they'd taken him, he was sitting up on a cot, holding a cloth to a cut on his forehead and arguing with Doc Morrison about whether he needed stitches. "Prudence," he said, his face lighting up when he saw her. "I'm fine, it's just a scratch." She crossed the room and slapped him. Not hard, but enough to make her point. Then she burst into tears. "Don't you dare," she sobbed. "Don't you dare die on me, Jackson Abbott. Don't you dare prove them all right." He pulled her into his arms, murmuring reassurances. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm fine. It'll take more than a spooked horse to get rid of me. You could have broken your neck," she said into his chest. "But I didn't. I've got a hard head. Just ask anyone who's tried to talk sense into me about this wedding." He pulled back enough to look at her face, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "I'm all right, I promise." Doc Morrison cleared his throat. "He'll have a nasty bruise and a headache for a few days, but he'll live. Though I'll say this, Abbott, you're either the luckiest man I've ever met or the unluckiest, depending on how you look at it." "Luckiest," Jackson said firmly, his eyes never leaving Prudence's face. "Definitely the luckiest." When they returned to town, the whispers started immediately. The curse had struck. He'd survived this time, but it was only a matter of time. Prudence heard it all and felt the familiar weight of guilt and fear settling over her shoulders. That night, she sat in her kitchen and seriously considered calling off the wedding. She loved Jackson too much to risk his life. Maybe the town was right. Maybe she was cursed. Maybe the kindest thing she could do would be to let him go. She was still sitting there, tears streaming down her face, when Jackson knocked on her door well after dark. She shouldn't have let him in. It wasn't proper for an unmarried man to visit a woman alone at night, but she was too wrung out to care about propriety. He took one look at her face and knew. "You're thinking of calling it off?" It wasn't a question. She nodded miserably. Jackson sat down across from her, taking her hands in his. "Prudence, listen to me. I got thrown from a horse. It happens to cowboys. It's part of the job. It has nothing to do with curses or bad luck or anything except a green horse and my own carelessness. But what if next time? There's always a next time. That's life. We can't control what happens to us. All we can control is how we choose to live." He squeezed her hands. "I choose to live with you. As your husband, your partner, your love. I choose that every day, Prudence, and I'll keep choosing it no matter what anyone says." "I'm so scared," she whispered. "I know, but I'm not. I'm not scared of dying. I'm only scared of living without you." He brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Trust me, trust us. We're going to be all right." Looking into his eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there, Prudence felt her fear begin to ease. He was right. She couldn't control fate, couldn't protect him from every possible danger. All she could do was choose love, choose hope, choose to believe that this time would be different. "All right," she said softly. "All right, we'll get married. Damn right we will." He pulled her into his arms and she went willingly, letting his strength surround her. "In 12 days, you're going to be my wife and we're going to start our life together, and it's going to be wonderful." The final days before the wedding passed in a blur. Jackson moved his few belongings into Prudence's small house, despite the scandal it caused. "We're getting married in less than 2 weeks, he said when someone complained. "I'm not going to pretend we're not building a life together." Prudence spent her days finishing her wedding dress, a simple but pretty creation in cream-colored cotton. She had no veil, no fancy flowers, no bridesmaids in matching gowns. But she had Jackson, and that was enough. The night before the wedding, there was a knock on the door. Prudence opened it to find Mrs. Richardson, the wife of Jackson's employer, standing on her porch with a basket. "May I come in?" Mrs. Richardson asked. Prudence stepped aside, wary. Mrs. Richardson had never been overtly cruel, but she'd never been friendly either. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Richardson said once they were seated. "My husband and I have watched Jackson these past months, and I've never seen a man more in love or more certain of his choices. He talks about you constantly, your kindness, your strength, your courage. He made me realize that we've all been terribly unfair to you." Prudence stared at her, not sure how to respond. "I know it's late, and I know it doesn't make up for the way this town has treated you," Mrs. Richardson continued, "but I brought you these." She opened the basket to reveal a beautiful bouquet of late-blooming roses and asters. "For your wedding, and I'd like to come if you'll have me. You shouldn't have to stand up there alone." Tears pricked Prudence's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know. I also told my husband that if anything happens to Jackson, anything at all, whether it's in a year or in 50 years, he's to make sure everyone knows it's not your fault. We've let superstition and fear rule us for too long." She reached out and squeezed Prudence's hand. "I hope you'll both be very happy together." After Mrs. Richardson left, Prudence held the flowers and cried, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief. She wasn't completely alone. At least one person in this town was willing to see the truth. Her wedding day dawned clear and bright. A perfect October morning with golden sunlight and a crisp breeze. Prudence dressed carefully in her simple gown, arranged her hair as best she could, and carried Mrs. Richardson's bouquet. She had no family present. Her parents had died years ago, and her sister in Denver was too far away to make the journey. But as she walked to the small church, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was meant to be. Whatever happened after this, she and Jackson were meant to find each other. The church was nearly empty. Mrs. Richardson sat in the front pew with her husband. Doc Morrison was there, looking skeptical but not hostile. A few of the ranch hands Jackson worked with had come to support him. The rest of the pews were empty. But when Prudence walked through the door and saw Jackson standing at the altar, nothing else mattered. He was wearing his best clothes, his hair neatly combed, and the look on his face when he saw her could only be described as reverent. She walked down the aisle alone, her head high, and placed her hand in Jackson's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. Reverend Peterson performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, rushing through the words as if he wanted to get it over with before divine retribution struck. But Prudence barely heard him. She was focused entirely on Jackson, on the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world, on the strength and certainty in his voice when he repeated his vows. "I, Jackson Abbott, take you, Prudence Barlow, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Until death do us part." The words that had ended 3 times before. But this time, Prudence let herself believe they might mean a lifetime. When it was her turn, her voice was clear and strong. "I, Prudence Barlow, take you, Jackson Abbott, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Peterson said hastily. "You may kiss your bride." Jackson cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Prudence felt her heart overflow. When they pulled apart, both smiling, she was Prudence Abbott, and for the first time in years she felt truly happy. They had a small reception at the Richardson ranch. Mrs. Richardson had insisted. There was food and drink and even some music when one of the ranch hands pulled out a fiddle. It wasn't the grand celebration Jackson deserved, but it was filled with warmth and genuine good wishes from the few people who'd chosen to support them. As the sun set, Jackson and Prudence rode back to their home now, not just hers. He helped her down from her horse and swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protests. "Tradition," he said firmly, setting her down in the middle of their small parlor. "We're going to do this right." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Prudence felt the last of her reservations melt away. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That night, lying in Jackson's arms, Prudence felt a peace she'd never experienced with her previous husbands. This was right. This was real. This was love the way it was supposed to be. "What are you thinking?" Jackson murmured, his hand stroking through her hair. "That I'm happy," she said simply. "Truly, completely happy." "Good." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Because I plan to keep you that way for the next 50 or 60 years. Promise. Promise." The first weeks of their marriage were blissful. Jackson continued working at the Richardson ranch while Prudence tended her garden and the house. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, Jackson reading aloud while Prudence painted, or simply talking about their days. It was domestic and ordinary and perfect. The town gradually began to relax. When a week passed, then 2, then a month, and Jackson showed no signs of dropping dead, the whispers began to change. Maybe the curse was broken. Maybe love had triumphed after all. Maybe they'd all been wrong. Not everyone was willing to admit they'd been mistaken, of course. There were still those who crossed the street when they saw Prudence coming, who muttered about witchcraft and devil's bargains. But there were also those who started nodding to her in the street, who allowed that perhaps, just perhaps, coincidence rather than curse had claimed her previous husbands. Winter came to Park City, bringing snow that blanketed the mountains and turned the world into something clean and new. Jackson taught Prudence to ice skate on the frozen pond outside town, laughing as they both tumbled repeatedly onto the ice. They celebrated Christmas with the Richardsons, and Prudence felt the unfamiliar warmth of being part of a community again, even if it was a small one. In January, Prudence realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She desperately wanted a child, wanted to build a family with Jackson. But what if the curse extended to children? What if something went wrong? When she told Jackson, he picked her up and spun her around their kitchen, whooping with delight. Then he set her down carefully as if she were made of glass, his hands on her still flat belly. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "You're not worried?" she asked. "About what?" "Prudence, this is the best news I've ever gotten. We're going to have a family." "But what if something happens? What if?" He kissed her quiet. "Nothing is going to happen. You're going to have a beautiful, healthy pregnancy, and in the summer, we're going to have a beautiful, healthy baby, and we're going to be the happiest family in all of Utah." His certainty was infectious. Despite her fears, Prudence found herself believing him, letting herself dream of the future they would build together. She was 5 months along, her belly growing round and firm when disaster struck again. Jackson was bringing a herd of cattle down from the high pastures when a late spring storm rolled in, fierce and unexpected. Lightning struck close to the herd, spooking them into a stampede. Jackson's horse went down, throwing him directly in the path of hundreds of panicked animals. Prudence was at home when the Richardson ranch hand came pounding on her door, his face pale with shock. "Mrs. Abbott, there's been an accident. You need to come quick." The ride to the ranch was the longest of Prudence's life. her mind filled with horrific images, with the certainty that the curse had finally claimed Jackson, that she was about to become a widow for the fourth time, that the town had been right all along. When she burst into the ranch house, she found Jackson lying on the couch, covered in mud and blood but conscious. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle and his face was tight with pain, but he was alive. "I'm all right," he said immediately when he saw her. "Prudence, I'm all right." She collapsed beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch and cause more pain. "What happened?" "Horse went down in the stampede. Broke my leg and got trampled a bit, but nothing vital." He managed a weak smile. "Takes more than a few cattle to kill me." Doc Morrison bustled in then, shooing Prudence away so he could work. The next hour was agonizing as the doctor set Jackson's broken leg, the bone-deep crack making Prudence feel faint. But through it all, Jackson remained conscious, gripping her hand and assuring her he was fine. Finally, Doc Morrison stepped back, wiping his hands. "He'll live. The leg will heal, though he'll need to stay off it for at least 6 weeks. He was damned lucky a few inches to the left, and that stampede would have crushed his skull." After the doctor left, Prudence helped Jackson into their wagon and drove him home. She got him settled in their bed and then sat beside him, her hands shaking with delayed shock. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "When they came to get me, I was so sure, but I'm not dead." He reached up to cup her face. "I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm going to stay that way. How can you be so sure?" "Because I have too much to live for." His hand moved to her belly where their baby was growing. "I'm not going anywhere, Prudence, not now, not ever." The next morning, the town was buzzing with the news. Jackson Abbott had nearly died in a stampede. The curse had struck again. It was only a matter of time before he met the same fate as the others. But as the days passed and Jackson healed, the narrative began to shift again. He'd survived. Against all odds, he'd walked away from something that should have killed him with nothing more than a broken leg. Maybe he really was different. Maybe their love really was strong enough to break the curse. Prudence tried not to listen to any of it. She focused instead on taking care of Jackson, who was a terrible patient. He hated being confined to bed, hated being unable to work, hated feeling useless. But he bore it with as much grace as he could muster, and Prudence loved him all the more for trying. As his leg healed, they spent long hours together, talking and planning for the future. Jackson had been saving money from his work at the Richardson Ranch, and he had dreams of buying a small piece of land where they could start their own operation. "Nothing fancy," he said, his hand resting on Prudence's belly as the baby kicked beneath his palm. "Just enough for some cattle, maybe some horses, a place that's ours, where we can raise our family and build something lasting." "That sounds perfect," Prudence said softly. By early summer, Jackson was back on his feet, though he walked with a slight limp that Doc Morrison assured them would fade with time. And on a blazing hot day in July, after 12 hours of labor, Prudence gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel Thomas, after her first and third husbands, and Robert for the second. Jackson held the tiny bundle with a look of such wonder and love that Prudence felt her heart might burst. "He's perfect," Jackson whispered, his finger gently stroking their son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around it, gripping tight. "Absolutely perfect." "So are you," Prudence said, watching her husband with their child. After all the loss, all the pain, all the fear, this moment of pure joy felt almost too much to bear. The town's attitude toward them shifted dramatically after Samuel was born. A widow who'd lost 3 husbands was one thing, but a mother with a healthy baby and a living husband was quite another. Prudence found herself being greeted on the street, being invited to church socials, being welcomed back into the fold of respectable society. Part of her wanted to be bitter about it, to remember all the cruelty and rejection. But Jackson counseled forgiveness. "They were scared," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Samuel slept in Prudence's arms. "Fear makes people cruel, but they're trying to make amends now. We should let them." "You're too forgiving," she said, but there was no heat in it. "I'm too happy to hold grudges," he corrected. "I have everything I ever wanted right here. Why would I waste energy being angry?" As Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler, Jackson and Prudence saved every penny they could. Mr. Richardson, grateful for Jackson's years of loyal service and impressed by the way he'd handled the town's scorn, helped them secure a loan to buy a small ranch about 5 miles outside Park City. It wasn't much, just 100 acres and a modest house, but it was theirs. They moved in just before Samuel's 2nd birthday, and Prudence had never felt more at home. She planted a larger garden, filling it with vegetables and flowers. Jackson started building their herd, buying a few head of cattle and some horses. It was hard work, but it was good work, and they were building something together. 3 years after Samuel was born, Prudence found herself pregnant again. This time there was no fear, only joy. She'd learned that love was stronger than any curse, real or imagined. Their daughter, Ruth, was born in the spring, a healthy, squalling bundle who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair. "Two perfect children," Jackson said, cradling Ruth while Samuel climbed onto his lap to see his new sister. "We're the luckiest people alive." Prudence watched her family, her husband, her son, her daughter, and had to agree. The woman who'd been shunned as cursed, who'd buried 3 husbands and thought she'd never know real love, now had everything she'd ever dreamed of and more. Over the years, their ranch prospered. Jackson proved to be as good a rancher as he was a husband, building their operation through hard work and smart decisions. Prudence's garden became locally famous, and she started selling her produce and flowers at the market in town. She also continued painting, and while she never considered herself particularly talented, she found joy in capturing the beauty of their land on paper. Samuel and Ruth grew up healthy and happy, running wild over their ranch land, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with chores and filling the house with laughter. 3 years after Ruth came another son, James, followed 2 years later by another daughter, Grace. Jackson kept his promise. He didn't die young, didn't succumb to mysterious illness or tragic accident. He grew older alongside Prudence, his dark hair turning gray at the temples, his face gaining the weathered lines of a man who'd spent his life outdoors. And through it all, his love for Prudence never wavered. They'd been married 15 years when Jackson came home one evening with news. "I saw Reverend Peterson in town today," he said, sitting down at their kitchen table where Prudence was teaching Ruth to knead bread dough. "He asked if we'd be willing to talk to a young couple who's getting married next month." "Why would he want that?" Prudence asked, puzzled. The girl was widowed young. Her first husband died in a mining accident. Now she's found love again, but her fiancé's family is trying to talk him out of it, saying she's bad luck. Jackson smiled. The Reverend thought maybe hearing our story might give them courage. Prudence was quiet for a moment, remembering that terrible time when the whole town had believed she was cursed, when she'd been so sure that loving Jackson would lead to his death. Then she looked around at the life they'd built, their children playing in the next room, the home they'd made together, the love that had sustained them through hard times and good. "Yes," she said softly, "tell him we'd be happy to talk to them." They met with the young couple the following week. The girl, Sarah, was thin and nervous, her eyes haunted by loss. The man, Peter, was determined but clearly worried about the consequences of defying his family. "Everyone says I'm cursed," Sarah said quietly. "They say I'll kill him too just by loving him." Prudence reached across the table and took the young woman's hand. "I know exactly how you feel. I buried 3 husbands before I met Jackson. The whole town called me cursed. They told him he'd be dead within the year if he married me." "But you weren't cursed," Sarah said, looking at Jackson, who was very much alive, bouncing little Grace on his knee. "No, I was just unlucky, and so were my husbands. But that's all. It was bad luck. Not a curse, not a judgment from God, just the randomness of life." Prudence squeezed Sarah's hand. "Don't let fear steal your chance at happiness. Don't let other people's superstitions rob you of love." Jackson nodded. "Life is full of risks. We could wrap ourselves in cotton wool and never take a chance, and we'd still die eventually. The only question is whether we've lived first. Whether we've loved first. But what if something happens to him?" Sarah's voice broke. "I couldn't bear it if then you'd bear it anyway," Prudence said gently. "Because that's what we do. We love even knowing we might lose. We take the risk because the alternative, living without love, is so much worse." The young couple left looking more hopeful, and 2 months later, Prudence and Jackson attended their wedding. It was a small affair, but joyful, and Prudence felt a deep satisfaction in knowing they'd helped someone else find the courage to love despite fear. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle lost to disease and crops that failed. But there were also birthdays and holidays, barn dances and church socials. Ordinary days made extraordinary by love and laughter. Samuel grew into a fine young man who looked so much like Jackson that it made Prudence's heart ache sometimes. He married a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch and gave them their first grandchildren. Ruth became a teacher, bright and passionate about education. James took to ranching like he'd been born to it, already talking about expanding their operation. Little Grace, no longer so little, showed a talent for painting that far exceeded her mother's, her watercolors of the Utah landscape earning praise throughout the territory. Through it all, Jackson remained Prudence's rock, her partner, her greatest love. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when weather allowed, holding hands and watching the sunset like they had when they were first married. The passion that had drawn them together had mellowed into something deeper and more sustaining. A love built on shared history, mutual respect, and the bone-deep knowledge that they were meant to be together. "You ever regret it?" Prudence asked one evening when they were both in their 50s, their hair gray and their faces lined, but their love as strong as ever. "Taking a chance on the cursed widow." Jackson turned to her with the same warm smile he'd given her that first day in the post office, all those years ago. "Not for a single second. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Prudence Abbott, the very best thing." "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time she'd spoken them. "I love you too. Always have, always will." When Prudence turned 60, their children threw them a party to celebrate both her birthday and their 37th wedding anniversary. Friends and neighbors filled their ranch house, and Prudence marveled at how much had changed since that first lonely year after Thomas's death. She was no longer the cursed widow, shunned and feared. She was Prudence Abbott, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend. The woman who'd proven that love could triumph over fear, that courage could break any curse, that happy endings were possible even after the darkest beginnings. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and their children were cleaning up, Jackson pulled Prudence outside onto the porch. The night was clear and cool, the stars blazing overhead in the vast Utah sky. "Dance with me," he said, pulling her into his arms. "There's no music," she pointed out, but she was already swaying with him. "We'll make our own." They moved together in the starlight, and Prudence rested her head against Jackson's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The heart that had kept beating year after year, defying all predictions, proving all the fearful whispers wrong. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For being my fourth husband, for not being afraid, for loving me enough to take the chance." Jackson pulled back enough to look at her face, his eyes soft in the moonlight. "Prudence, you've got it backwards. You took a chance on me. You could have sent me away, protected yourself from more loss, more pain. But you were brave enough to try again, to open your heart one more time. That's real courage. We were brave together," she said. "That we were. And look what we built with that courage." He gestured to their ranch, their home, the family sleeping under their roof. Not bad for a cursed widow and a stubborn cowboy, not bad at all. They stood together on the porch of the life they'd built, holding each other under the stars, and Prudence felt a deep, abiding peace. The town had said she was cursed after 3 dead husbands. The cowboy had said he'd be her fourth. And he'd kept that promise in ways that went far beyond simply surviving. He'd been her partner, her love, her champion. He'd stood beside her through fear and joy, hardship and plenty. He'd given her children and grandchildren, a home and a life worth living. He'd proven that love was real, that curses were nothing but superstition, that happy endings existed for those brave enough to reach for them. Years later, when they were both in their 70s and slowing down, Jackson still made Prudence laugh every single day. He still kissed her every morning and every night. He still looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "How did I get so lucky?" she asked him one afternoon as they sat in their garden, watching their great-grandchildren play. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Jackson said, taking her hand in his. "This was always meant to be, you and me. From the moment I walked into that post office and saw you, I knew, some things are just meant to be, Prudence. We're one of those things. You really believe that?" "With every fiber of my being." She leaned against him, content. After all the loss, all the pain, all the fear that she was doomed to destroy everyone she loved, she'd found this. Peace. Joy. A love that had lasted decades and would last until their final breath. The curse had been nothing but coincidence and bad luck. The real magic had been Jackson's courage, her willingness to try again, and the love they'd built together brick by brick, day by day, year by year. They lived to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The curse long forgotten by everyone, except as a story they told to illustrate the power of love over fear. Jackson Abbott died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, holding Prudence's hand, a smile on his weathered face. He'd been her husband for 52 years, and true to his word, he'd been her last. The cowboy who'd been brave enough to say, "I'll be your fourth," when the whole town believed she was cursed. Prudence lived another 5 years after Jackson's death, surrounded by the family they'd built together. She spent her days painting and tending her garden and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the man who'd loved her enough to defy a curse. When she finally passed, also peacefully in her sleep, she was buried beside Jackson in the Park City Cemetery. Their graves sat on a hill overlooking the valley where they'd built their life together, their headstones simple but telling: Jackson Abbott, 1846–1927. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, he loved without fear. Prudence Abbott, 1853–1932. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She lived without regret, and below both inscriptions, added by their children, a final epitaph. Their love broke every curse and proved that the bravest thing we can do is love anyway. The town that had once whispered about curses and death now told a different story, a love story. The tale of a widow who'd lost everything and a cowboy who'd given her the world. A story of courage and faith, of love that conquered fear, of happy endings that came to those brave enough to reach for them. Their ranch stayed in the family for generations, their great-great-grandchildren still working the land that Jackson and Prudence had tamed together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset painted the Utah mountains gold and red, people swore they could see two figures on the old ranch house porch, holding hands and watching the sky, their love as eternal as the land itself.